thank you very much for joining us today to listen to my Snack and Learn webinar, Exploration of the Human Factors in an Emergency Situation in a Road Tunnel. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping. The slides are available on the panel that you have access to. They're under the handout section. If you do have any questions, please can you put them in the chat section on the panel, and hopefully we will have time at the end where we can go through and answer as many questions as possible. So sit back, relax. I hope you can understand my accent, and yeah, let's start exploring human factors in an emergency situation. So what we're going to cover today is, obviously I'm going to introduce myself in a moment. I'm going to talk a little bit about human factors. What is it? What are we talking about? And then I'm going to talk about a project that I did in Wales in the UK, along a stretch of the A55, one of the key roads running across the top of Wales. Then we're going to talk a bit about some of the human factors. Obviously today is just a summary of the work that I did. So it'll cover how people behave, why they behave in the way that they do, how this can hinder their ability to interact with the equipment in the tunnel, some potential considerations, and then, like I said, a Q&A session at the end. So who am I? So Cathy Wilson-Ellis, I've been at WSP for 2 years now, but my career started many years ago in police intelligence. So my role there was obviously understanding who was committing what crime. But the idea was to try and disrupt the chain of events that led to that crime occurring in order to prevent it from happening in the first place. So it was really about understanding what made people do what they do, what influenced their actions and their behaviours. I did that for 16 years, then left and went to Highways England, who managed the strategic road network in the UK. Did various roles working, trying to prevent incidents on the motorway network, and ultimately worked my way up to a strategic road safety role, where again, similar thing, trying to prevent fatal road traffic collisions and understanding why some people died and some people didn't, you know, what factors influence that outcome and how could we change the root cause and the sequence of events. And like I said, last 2 years I've been here at WSP, where I'm trying to share this knowledge and experience that I have to try and basically make the world a better place. So as you can see, all through my career, it's been about the human. It's been about understanding why people do what they do in order to, if possible, change it, influence it, and get a different outcome. So what is human factors? What am I talking about? Well, basically, the easiest way to explain human factors is it's about understanding why people do what they do. Because if you can understand that, what influences us, how we interpret information, how that affects us physically and psychologically, you can use that information to improve performance, to make systems more efficient and improve safety. So the diagram that's just popping up on the right hand side of the screen kind of summarizes human factors in an academic sense. So it's a combination of different sciences. So I've already said about psychology, but obviously you've got sociology in there. So it's about how things around us affect us as humans. You've got physics, especially in the road safety environment. That's been really important to understand kinetic forces when collisions do occur. Why does that seem to affect certain people more than others? And that then links into your biomechanics and how it actually affects you physically and how the body actually works. And anthropometry, I just love saying that because it took me 2 years to learn how to say it. But that's basically the science of everybody's different. We're all different sizes, we're all different shapes, and that can impact whenever we're designing something or trying to understand something. And a really quick kind of overview of the Swiss cheese model. So this is really important, I think, when it comes to understanding human factors and what we do. So basically in this scenario, I've used good old COVID that I'm sure we're all familiar with. The logic of the model is each slice of cheese represents one of the different mitigations that can be put in place to try and prevent the transmission of COVID. So that could be social distancing, could be wearing a mask, so on and so forth. Now, you don't have to do all of those to reduce the risk of transmission. You just have to do one of them. And the way the Swiss cheese model works is if you misalign those holes that are running through the cheese, you get a different outcome. That's kind of human factors. I'm trying to understand these slices of cheese in order to misalign the holes and get a different outcome. So I'm going to talk to you very briefly about this work I did in Wales. So as you can see on the map there, that's a map of the UK. The red blob just up from where it says Liverpool, that area there is Wales. And we're talking about the road tunnels that are on the A55, which run along the very top of Wales. As you can see from the map at the bottom, that just illustrates just how harsh the landscape is around there. Basically, the A55 runs right along the coast on one side, and on the other side, there's lots of hills, lots of mountains. That's why it's unsurprising you've got 3 road tunnels on that stretch of road, quite close to each other. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce them properly in Welsh, but that's where the tunnels are, and that's what we're talking about today. One thing I do really want to stress before I get into detail is I am not, nor do I pretend to be in any way, a tunnels engineer. I am a human factors specialist. I have lots of experience working in a strategic policy type environment. And I guess the fact that I'm not a tunnels engineer is the reason why the client actually came to us, actually asked for me to do this work, because they wanted somebody who was going to come at it with perhaps a different approach and a different perspective on things. And they really wanted to understand how the road users would interact with the equipment that they've already got in the tunnels, which are already regulation compliant and standard compliant. They wanted to understand that human element, which is why I came along. So basically, there was a couple of key research questions, but in summary, it was about understanding how people actually react when they're in an emergency situation. Predominantly, we're talking about a fire scenario. What affects them, what factors influence those behaviours, how can that actually affect their ability to escape safely and quickly, and what things could be done to try and improve that. So just moving on. So the first start of the project was obviously doing some research, and what became evident very sadly, very quickly, was that when we looked at information from other countries where there had been sadly fire emergencies in road tunnels, when sadly there'd been high numbers of fatalities, as you can see on the screen, quite a high proportion of the people who had died in that terrible situation were actually found still in the vehicles, quite often with the seatbelt on. Now, logic would say to you, well, why would that be? Surely if you're in a tunnel and it's on fire, you're going to get out your car, you're going to get out your vehicle, and you're going to try your best to get out either the way you came in, the exit, or through one of the emergency exits portal doors. Why on earth would you sit in your car when the tunnel's on fire? Well, the reason for the reason why people stay sat in the car, and sadly we can't check this with those people because obviously sadly they're not here anymore, but it goes back to that human behavior and how humans behave in that frightened panic situation. And in that environment, the only thing that's actually familiar to those people is their vehicle. And not everybody has this flight response to panic where they just want to get out. Some people are actually frozen with fear. So actually it's quite understandable why they then stay in the car, because that's familiar to them. Putting your seatbelt on is quite a subconscious action and makes you feel safe because you've got the belt around you. So that explains why you find people, sadly, who have perished still in the vehicles. Obviously, there's also the thought that, well, if they're in the cars and the obstruction ahead, they might be able to drive out. But mainly it's to do with this feeling of security. Now, when you're driving through a tunnel, yes, there's lots of information there. There's direction signs. There's information about what to do in the state of an emergency. But obviously, that's great if you're a pedestrian, when you've got time to see the information and absorb it. But when you're actually driving through a road tunnel, certainly in the UK, they're not the biggest of tunnels. They tend to be 2 lanes usually as you're driving through. So suddenly you've gone from an open environment to a closed environment, which makes you feel a bit more closed in. The lanes may feel more narrow than they are outside the tunnel. It can be darker. Obviously, you've got your lights on, and people will be very much focusing on staying between the 2 white lines and trying to drive safely through that tunnel, not looking around, absorbing the information actually in the tunnel, such as, oh, well, that's where the fire extinguishers are in case I need them. That's where the emergency exit door is if I need it. They're just focusing on the end, getting through that tunnel without colliding with any other vehicles. As it says on the screen there, that there is lots of information in the tunnel and there's signs, but what can happen is, as humans, there's signs everywhere, especially when you're driving on the road network. Signs telling you to do everything, what you can do, what you can't do, where you can drive, where you can't drive. That you actually get to the state where you have this learned irrelevance, where you actually don't see them anymore because you're that used to seeing the signs. You actually stop seeing them. You become blind to them. So there is also the risk that even if there is information provided in the tunnel, not only are you concentrating on driving, you might just actually not see it. You might not actually physically spot that the information's there. So moving on a little bit about the human side of things. So as you're driving through that tunnel, and there's all this information going on, and sadly this event happens and there's a fire, it takes time for the body to actually recognize, hang on, there's an incident here, there's a threat to life, there's danger, there's this fire, there's smoke. And how the body functions physically takes time. So you're going to know there's a fire because you're going to see it, or you're going to smell the smoke, or you're going to hear alarms going off and panic. You're going to know something's wrong. There's this perception where you're trying to absorb the information around you and determine whether actually there is something wrong or, you know, what's going on. Now, that's a heavy cognitive load on your brain because it's taking all this information in, and then it has to kind of understand it and make sense of it and use other bits of reference that it may have it stored away in your brain, such as previous memories, previous experiences, previous, you know, training lessons that you may have had, to kind of understand what's going on, and therefore what do I need to do about it. And that doesn't happen instantly. So again, you need to be mindful that how we assume people will react when they're in an emergency situation in a tunnel might not always be the reality of how people will react. And that's one of the key messages I want to get across. Don't assume that people will do things in a certain way because that's logically how they should do it. Because one thing's for sure is people are not logical, and we very rarely do what we're supposed to do. And everybody is different, and everybody reacts to things for many, many different reasons. So taking all that information in can take some people longer than others. And there's a whole raft of reasons for that, but you'll be pleased to know I've not got time to go into that today. So just to move it on a little bit, part of the research was also looking at the different equipment that is available, certainly in the road tunnels that I was focusing on in Wales. And I was trying to get across to the client, yes, this is great, you've got this equipment and it's all compliant with the standards and the regulations, but you're assuming that the people in that tunnel will interact in a certain way. And what I came along was to say, actually, they'll probably not. So here's just a few examples of some standard emergency equipment and kind of some of the context of why people won't do what you think they're going to do in terms of interacting. So classic one is a PA system. So this is where if there is an event, it alerts to the control room, certainly in Wales where we are, and the operators will then speak through this PA system to try and advise people to keep calm, what to do, to get out of the vehicles, to make their way to the emergency exits, and that the emergency services are on the way. But obviously there's a big assumption there. You have to assume that the people in the tunnel can actually hear that message and that people can understand what that message is saying. So we have to think about bilingual. So in Wales, not everybody in Wales speaks English. Some people actually speak Welsh, which is a language all of its own. So that's just one example of, do they speak in English? Do they speak in Welsh? Do they speak in both? In which case that takes longer to cascade the message. That's just one example. That's assuming people even listen and can hear the message, let alone understand it. They may have their earphones in. What if they're deaf? What if they can't hear it? You know, what if they just don't understand what is being said? And one thing that I'll cover in a minute is when we talk about the jets that are on the ceilings of the tunnels, which are used to blow the smoke one direction or another, in this case cicada jets, actually the noise from the jets usually overrides the PA system. So the operator back at the control room believes they are giving advice and safety instructions, assuming that people are hearing it, understanding it, and acting on it. And there's a really good chance that they're not doing any of those things, and it's just kind of getting lost in the noise and the panic. People really want someone to take charge in this kind of situation. When people are frightened and they panic, they want somebody to just tell them exactly what to do. So in theory, the PA system does that, but sadly in reality, not always the case. Another piece of equipment, standard one, is a fire extinguisher. Now, I know it's different in different countries, but certainly in the UK, it is very rare that anybody has ever actually used a fire extinguisher. It's not something we have to carry as standard in our vehicles like you do in other countries, and it's very rare to have them in your home. Now, you're expecting, certainly in this scenario, people are in a tunnel, they're frightened, there's smoke, there's fire, there's panic, and you're expecting them to go over to the wall, pick up a fire extinguisher, carefully read the instructions, be rest assured that it's the right type of fire extinguisher to put the right source of fire out, somehow be able to take the safety mechanism off the top, which is never easy, and have the physical strength to squeeze the handle to be able to physically operate the fire extinguisher. And again, there's a lot of assumptions in there. What happens if the people who need to use it are elderly and don't have the physical strength in their hands to do it? What if they're disabled? What if, which is a high probability, they're actually not there on their own? So they've got young children with them, they might have pets with them, which they're certainly not going to leave in the car, no matter what you may assume they'd do. So they're going to be distracted and they're trying to balance all this whilst holding a fire extinguisher, whilst trying to put, a fire out to aid escape or whatever. So again, don't assume just because you've got a fire extinguisher that people know how to use it. It's probably better to assume there's a really good chance that people won't know how to use it and therefore probably won't use it. So just because they're provided doesn't mean they're going to be used. Going on to the ventilation system, so I've already mentioned about how noisy it can be and how it can override the PA system. And obviously not everybody understands how tunnels are built, how these jets are there, how they blow the smoke in certain directions. So again, people who are involved in the tunnel environment in that situation may say, oh, hang on, I know that's the jet, it's blowing the smoke that way, that's the way, whatever, I should be going. But most members of the public, me as well, don't know that kind of inside information. So they don't really understand what the jet's doing. So do they run the way the smoke's going or do they run the other way? We're just assuming people will understand. Again, probably not. Emergency doors. So again, we need to be mindful that people can get to them doors. Not everybody is fully able, as in, doesn't need a wheelchair. They may have passengers with them who are blind. They may have passengers with them who have mobility issues. So you've got to think about this, about where the emergency exits are. And even if they do go through the emergency exit doors, what are they going out onto? Some people might be scared of actually going through that door and walking straight into live traffic. They don't know what's on the other side of that door. And sadly, when I did some of the research, there was some examples of where actually the emergency exit door was painted exactly the same as the electric cabinet door. So in that scenario, again, there's a bit of a risk that you're either going to go through the emergency exit door, potentially into traffic, or you could potentially, through an electric cabinet. I know that's far-fetched, but I'm just trying to get the point across. These things need to be really clear to the road users about what they need to do in these situations. Just going to speed it up a little bit so we've got time for questions at the end. So signs, as it says on the screen, we just need to be mindful that we may have signs up telling people where to go and what to do. But if the tunnel's filled with smoke, are you going to be able to read that sign? Are you going to be able to read the language of the sign? What if you've got, vision issues or you've got language barriers? So again, we need to consider those signs. But I know there's a lot of work done in that area. So I guess just coming up to the last few slides, it's about understanding that everybody who's in that road tunnel are different. They all have a different reason for being there. They're all doing different journeys. They've all got different levels of ability, physically, mentally. We'll have elderly people, we'll have people with young children, people with pets. You may have people traveling in a group. So for example, in a coach, and what they're naturally going to do is group together, called the herd effect. So they're going to be moving away this big mass of people assuming that whoever's at the front is in charge and knows what they're doing. There's a good chance that person in front and in charge has no idea what they're doing and could be leading them all the wrong way. But they're all going to follow him because that's naturally what humans do. We want somebody to take control, somebody to lead us out of danger, someone to rescue us. That's just a natural response. So as it says on the screen, people are different. People will react differently. And please, if you take nothing else away from today, never assume how someone is going to react, because I can guarantee they'll react in a different way. So just coming to the end, talked about consideration. So this is just a snippet of what we gave back to the client. So obviously they needed to consider where the PA system went. They need to think about acoustic treatment on the walls, anything that you can do to aid that interaction between the human and the equipment that you're hoping that they'll use in that event. But one of the absolute biggest things we need to do, certainly we put forward in the UK, is education. We've got to educate the road users so they know what to do in the unlikely event of something happening in a road tunnel. You know, it could be something that we incorporate in driving tests and driving lessons, or through employers, because most people are employed, therefore they have a car, therefore they work. You know, getting these messages out there to say, look, it's very rare it'll happen, but if it happens, you do X, Y, and Z. That way, if it did ever happen, when you go back to that cognitive functioning I mentioned at the beginning, they've actually got something to reference. They've got something to lean back on that says, actually, I know what I should do in this situation. This is how I use a fire extinguisher, or this is what I need to do. And that brings us to the end, really. So this slide just shows how the work that I did, how it links up to our wider sustainable development goals. So obviously this falls under the industry and the infrastructure element, and also sustainability in communities. Now, the reason I've linked it to communities is road users are part of the community. So obviously it's in our interest to support that and try and make the environment that our communities live and travel in do so in a safe manner. And there you go. Down to questions, and I'm going to hand over to Sharon, who's hopefully going to share some questions. Thank you for your time, everyone.
Thank you, Kathy, for a fantastic presentation. So before moving into the Q&A period, I would like to remind attendees to enter your questions in the question box on the GoToWebinar platform, and also you can download a PDF version of the presentation from the handout box on the dashboard. I will start with the first question. Did the scope include commercial users of the network as well as private individuals?
The actual research I did was more looking at people in general, so it wasn't going into the detail of what types of vehicle they were in or what journey types they were making. However, there was further discussions at the end of this, and there's work still ongoing as a result of this research with the client, to say that I talked about education. There may be an option, not just trying to get into the driving lessons for all road users, was perhaps we could look at what are deemed to be professional drivers, so your HGV, your commercial drivers, and see if there's a way of upskilling them as part of the regulatory training that they have to do in the UK, the CPD. If there's a way of incorporating some knowledge so that in this event, they would be able to take charge and be the leaders to get the people out using that herding effect and be the ones who kind of know exactly what to do because they've received that training. So there are discussions ongoing about that.
Thank you. How can we educate road users to know what to do in an emergency situation? I believe you mentioned most of it in the presentation. If you can summarize it a bit again. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Like I said, driving lessons is the probably, I say easiest, but having worked for the government for a long time, there's nothing easy about trying to change driving regulations and standards and driving tests, because it's such a complicated process. So trying to educate is one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is actually through employers. So I briefly touched on it, but from my experience of working on the motorway network, how you engage with the road users is very difficult, because how do you actually get to them? You can put messages up, but they won't always read it and understand it, as we've covered today. You can get to various vehicle associations, but quite often the people in those associations aren't the ones that you're trying to actually get to share messages, for example, in a compliance situation. But a common denominator is the vast majority of people who drive a vehicle are either commuting to or from work, driving for work purposes, or they're on a leisure journey in a vehicle that's funded by somebody who's employed. So the common denominator is the employer. So the way in Highways England we started to address this education need was to actually go through the employers, get the employers to cascade the messages to their employees. And the way we got them on board and willing to do that was to be able to prove to them, look, if you cascade this education and you invest in your employees, you're going to get a massive financial reward for it, in terms of you'll have a reduction in how many of your vehicles break down, therefore your deliveries don't get made. You're going to have an increase in customer satisfaction because you're getting your deliveries where they need to be, so your reputation's improved. You know, a reduction in insurance costs, your staff being off sick, that kind of thing. So if you go in talking about, we need you to start helping with education, you're not going to get anywhere. But if you go in and say, we've got a way of working together that's actually going to save you a load of money, then they'll listen.
Thank you. There's a question here. Did you consider on your study the effect on fixed firefighting system, like water mist or deluge? I think I'm pronouncing it right, deluge system on people's evacuation.
Yes and no. The reason I'm saying that is, no, it wasn't as part of the research, because it was just looking at the actual equipment that was in the 3 particular tunnels that were on the A55, of which it's just fire extinguishers. But it was part of the recommendations that there is, you know, the potential to use technology such as, I think it's called the waterfall, where it comes up with a laser and it says the stop sign on it. You know, there is the potential to explore the use of different systems to get greater interaction. And actually, after doing this piece of research, it's led on to quite a few other pieces. One is understanding why people fail to comply when the road tunnel is closed, so be it for the emergency situation or even maintenance. Now, certainly on the A55, the area I was focused on, one of the biggest problems is the massive diversion route. If that route is closed, it's something like a 50-mile diversion route to get round. So people tend to ignore the closure and risk it and try and get through the tunnel. So obviously there's work being done on the compliance, and there was also work being done on greater use of technology to try and better prepare people if they are approaching that emergency situation.
Thank you. There's a comment here about the Blackwall tunnel fire in London, where the comment is saying the tunnel user continued driving out and making videos of the fire. What is, in your opinion, the tunnel operation responsibility here?
As somebody who isn't a tunnel engineer or expert, I wouldn't like to answer that in great detail. The bit that I can comment on is the fact that people are starting to do this more and more. It's kind of becoming a human nature response to film everything and record everything and upload it onto social media. And again, we need to be aware of that now, that, you know, going back to this assumption and how people will behave, you would assume that in an emergency situation, people are just going to be so focused on trying to get out. Again, actually, in reality, there's going to be a proportion of the people in there are going to be getting the phones out and recording it, so it can then be uploaded on social media and what have you. So again, I've not really answered the question. I've kind of gone around it a little bit. But if you do want us to ask, you know, one of our colleagues who is a tunnel expert on responsibility and ownership, I can pass the question on.
Thank you. The last question is that we have time today is what are the lessons learned from other tunnel environments and how they prepare for emergency situation in that cases?
In some of the other tunnels that I was looking at in different countries, obviously it's difficult to always compare, because the 3 tunnels that I was focused on are very short tunnels, whereas in other countries they tend to be much longer. And in different parts of the UK, but my focus was just on these really short 3 tunnels on the A55. Quite often they'll have areas like refuge areas. So again, there was one particular piece of research. Again, sadly, people had been found perish actually in the refuge areas, because the fire brigade, the fire engines, couldn't actually get close enough to start fighting the fire, because whilst people had left the vehicles in that situation, they'd done again what's a human response, which is to lock it and go away with the keys. And again, they may not consciously have thought, oh, someone's going to steal my car or someone's going to steal my contents, but it's just a natural response. You don't leave your car unless you lock it and you take your keys away, which then makes it very difficult for the fire service to get in and get to the refuge area. But there was other examples, again, which we're looking at. We did a wider piece of work looking at different tunnel environments, so such as underground railway, looking at ferries. We were trying, again, a ferry doesn't have a tunnel, but we were trying to think of other environments that were kind of enclosed, where people who were unfamiliar in that environment would be, and how do they prepare for an emergency situation. See if there was any lessons could be learned from wider than just looking at tunnels, but different environments. And that's still ongoing. The key finding we have pulled out, it's a bit of a no-brainer when you're looking at the underground, is the key difference they have there is they have trained personnel on scene who take charge in that situation, which obviously you don't have in a road tunnel.
Thank you. Thank you, Kathy, for a fantastic presentation. So
Very
we're at the end of our webinar session. Please feel free to follow up directly with Kathy via the contact details shown on the screen. And I would like to thank all attendees for joining today. Thank you very much for your time.
Very welcome. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. I will wrap up the webinar now. Thank you. Have a wonderful